Greetings, fellow tarot travelers, tripping through the tetrahedral triptych of cards I shall lay before you. I'm Tarot Torch.
So now let's turn our attention to the United Arab Emirates, otherwise known as the UAE. Now, the UAE has a long history of working with the United States. It worked with the United States in the Lebanese Civil War from 1976 to 1979. It worked with the United States from 1990 to 1991 in the Gulf War, the first Libyan Civil War of 2011. It also worked with the United States in the second Libyan Civil War, which was from 2014 to present, the war on ISIS, which is 2014 to present, the Yemeni Civil War, which is 2015 to present, and the Sinai Insurgency, which is 2018 to present, which means there are 4 active wars currently fought by the UAE with America. And there's a reason for this. You know, there's only a few companies that can find oil and can actually drill and slant drill oil. And these companies are located in the United States and in England. And so they depend, the UAE, well, in the 1970s was an impoverished desert region, and now it has the largest GDP in the Middle East, and Dubai is one of the richest international cities for global trade in the world, and that's because of oil money. And it is thought that if Iran and Saudi Arabia went to war, the UAE would support Saudi interests and thus forge an alliance that would be roughly equal to Iran. So the United States, who basically, and England, who basically found the oil and drilled the oil and gave them their incredible wealth, are their ally. And it's been decided in the balance of power that the UAE will be with Saudi Arabia and Qatar will be with Turkey. And this is how the balance of power seems to work best when trying to offset the power of Iran and also other countries in the world. Now, the UAE has a small in number armed forces, but it's some of the most modern weapon systems in the world. And most of the troops in the that are Emirati are, you know, a few of them are citizens from other countries like Pakistan, but the officers are all UAE nationals. And these UAE nationals who are officers mostly are graduates of the United Kingdom's Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, with others having attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, the Royal Military College, Duntroon and St. Cyr, the Military Academy of France. So France opened the Abu Dhabi base in May of 2009. And so as you see, the UAE has a long history fighting with America. It supports the countries that gave it economic prosperity, and these countries in turn have educated their officers. And the UAE basically, among other things, like exporting oil, runs a mercenary service, so to speak, and for usually American interests. Now, there's many examples of this. President Obama urged the UAE to stop the spread of al-Qaeda and other radical Islamist groups in southern Yemen, and they complied. So what did the UAE do? They went into Yemen and they established a parallel and separate government in Yemen with its own independent state, because, you know, the Saudis were floundering with their military strategy. They were just basically bombing civilians, and the blockade of the Yemen ports brought millions of people to the edge of starvation. The UAE had an intelligent approach. They're using private armies that they created, trained and funded in a bid to crush both jihadi militancy and Islamist political parties such as al-Islah. And the UAE influence extends across the southern coast, where the UAE is allied with the separatist southern movement, which is opposed to both the Houthis and the Hadi government. And the Emiratis have built a series of military bases and camps and established what is essentially, as I said, a parallel state, with its own security services who are not accountable to the Yemeni government. Now, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have revealed the existence of a network of secret prisons operated by the UAE and its proxy forces, who are accused of disappearing and torturing al-Islah members and anti-Houthi fighters from rival factions, and even activists and critics of the Saudi-UAE coalition. So the Yemeni ministers have taken to referring to the Emiratis as an occupation force, which in essence they are. And what these Emiratis have achieved in Yemen is creating private armies, propping up secessionists in the south, and conspiring to destroy the political system while controlling strategic waterways in the Arabian and Red Seas. And this just shows you how a very small but ambitious nation that has a well-trained military can project its power in the world. Now, after this war is over in Yemen, and if Saudi Arabia wins, then it's thought that Saudi Arabia and the UAE will rebuild Yemen and have control over it. Now, should Saudi Arabia and Yemen not win, then probably Iran will do the building and have the control. Now, this whole thing of building a parallel and separate state within national borders has also occurred by the UAE as their tactic of choice in Somalia. Now, in Somalia, the UAE trained hundreds of Somali troops in 2014, and since then, in 2014, it's been playing a major role in the region, and this is how the UAE enters, training troops in a wealthy nation that gives trade deals to the client state. The UAE had been paying the salaries of several hundred Somali soldiers and trained an anti-piracy force in Puntland state of Somalia. And the training mission ended after Somali police seized money in 3 unmarked bags of a Royal Jet plane at the Aden Ade airport in Mogadishu, according to the Somali Interior Minister. Now, this was a huge ordeal, the finding of this cash. They found a very large amount of cash, and it was all a setup to bring down the whole UAE because Somalia was frightened of them. The UAE had done it once again. They'd set up a separate parallel government within the national boundaries of Somalia. They did not any longer listen to Mogadishu, and they could easily bring down the government of Mogadishu. And so Mogadishu decided to start siding instead with Turkey and Qatar, because Turkey can provide the trade and Qatar can also provide military assistance. So the 2017 election of the Somali president, Mohammed Abdullahi Mohammed, came amid heightened tensions between Qatar and its neighbors in the Gulf, the leading antagonists of this standoff. Saudi Arabia and the UAE pushed for their allies in the region to cut ties with Qatar. So there's this competition going on. Instead, Abdullah Mohammed made a point of declaring neutrality in the conflict after his inauguration. And the UAE and Saudi Arabia would have preferred that the new president not have announced this publicly, but he did. And then he went even further and created a gesture of solidarity with Turkey. And so this created a diplomatic crisis. And Somalia's president perceived a slight from the UAE and increased its support for the president's rival. The UAE did, and it started to support the federal member states that challenged central Mogadishu rule. So they were basically going to bring down the state of Somalia by supporting outlying regions that would like to take over the central government. And this support contributed to heightened tensions in the already fragile relationship between the government and the 6 federal states. And such divisions served to weaken the governmental institutions, which allowed militant groups like al-Shabaab to thrive. And so the UAE has since escalated this rift by cutting aid programs and withdrawing personnel from the Somali capital in Mogadishu. Well, allowing the terrorist group al-Shabaab to thrive is a very central theme in all of this. Because you see, more than the $9.6 million that was held at the airport I mentioned earlier, that was in unmarked bags, that was done as a snub of the wealthy Arab state when Somali's security forces seized the civilian aircraft, Mogadishu claiming that the bags were suspicious, and the UAE claiming that this money was allocated to support the Somali army, and then accused the security forces of holding people on the plane at gunpoint. This was all done in order to shift allegiance from UAE to Turkey and Qatar. And in the meanwhile, the UAE started to do something very strange. You see, there's a demand for charcoal from wealthy Gulf states, which creates a steady stream of revenue for the militant group Al-Shabaab through the illegal Somali charcoal trade. You see, a UN estimate suggests that Al-Shabaab earns an annual $7.5 million from taxing the trade that satisfies the demand of numerous Gulf states, such as the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Oman, by transiting the charcoal through Iran. And what they're doing is that Al-Shabaab facilitates the illicit trade of charcoal by transiting it through Iran in order to obtain fake origin certificates, thus bypassing sanctions placed on the charcoal by the United Nations in order to reduce the power of Al-Shabaab and other Islamist groups in the region. But the UAE has refused to acknowledge its role in financing Al-Shabaab. It's playing the black market in Somali for the charcoal exports, which are worth about $150 million a year in the UAE alone. I mean, the $7.5 million was, the tax on it. It's actually, the product value is $150 million a year. And that's in the UAE alone. And so the point is that the UAE had, great success in going into this region and in Somalia, saying they were going to help with the military, creating a parallel state, threatening the government by basically creating trade deals and building a port and not listening to Mogadishu, and supporting the outlying regions against the centralized government. And when they went towards Qatar and Turkey, the UAE increased its support of Al-Shabaab by buying this charcoal and funding Al-Shabaab to attack the capital so that their hands weren't dirty with the overthrow of the government. It's a nasty business. Now, where else is the UAE doing this? Well, they're doing it in Libya. In Libya, there is a parallel government in the east, and Haftar is in charge of the military there. And it's through the UAE support of this military government where arms come in through Egypt to Haftar's troops, and where Russia's bankrolling it, and the UAE and America are supporting Haftar's takeover of the UN-mandated UN government of Tripoli, where England or London is handling the financial transactions of oil for French and Italian oil interests. And the UAE and everybody else, the EU and everybody else wants to see this oil business made more concrete under an iron dictator's fist, so that they don't have to worry about Islamicists and tribal warlords. So we see that the UAE has this history of going into regions and creating torture chambers, prisons, military, and they go in and create a separate state and then start funding the enemies of the centralized state if they complain too much about this separate state. And this is how America operates with the UAE in the Middle East. Well, I'd like to know from the tarot here, what is the future of the UAE and its adventuristic plays in the Middle East? And how is this affecting the world balance of power? So today we're using the Tarot de Marrakech, and this is once again my go-to deck for whenever we do Islamic countries like the UAE. And as you can tell, it looks like an Anglo man here, and that's because, once again, Muslims refuse to put images of humans in art. I mean, they watch television, but they won't put human figures in art, and they consider it desecrate. So the only Muslim decks are American or European decks that portray Muslim life. And although this is about Marrakesh life, it is ultimately an Islamic culture. It's not a UAE deck. I'm not aware of a UAE deck. And so we'll use it to divine the future and to learn to understand more about this complex geopolitical military strategy of the UAE and the UAE's role in the world's balance of power, and how it is offsetting Turkey and Qatar and working for Saudi Arabian interests. And you know, there's a whole bunch of questions about, you know, efficacy and war crimes. You know, Saudi Arabia, they behead people and crucify people, you know, even as a public spectacle. And the UAE is siding with them and building torture chambers, black ops sites. You know, it'd be like in America. How would you feel if Russia built a second government in Iowa in the cornfields and wasn't listening to Washington, D.C.? It'd be a very strange and eerie feeling, wouldn't it? And if they sided with Connecticut and Texas to overthrow the government, what would you think? So we're going to shuffle, and we've shuffled, and now we're cutting the deck. And we're going to see here what the cards have to say. I'm going to move the cards over to the side, and they're still in view, but we need maximum space to work in. And the first card is Le Saltimbanque, which is basically the magician card. And it's so interesting. Instead of a table, the magician has a rug on the ground, which is a very Muslim way of doing things. And you can see in his traditional dress and his hat that he is in an Islamic country with the mosque in the background, actually the minaret, and the people here in front of the wall, the adobe colored wall. It's really very much a quaint set of cards. And here is the magician. So, and I must say, if this is the past, the United Arab Emirates have done a magical job at building Abu Dhabi and Dubai, some of the richest cities in the world, my gosh, since the 1970s, and becoming a major world player in mercenary militarism since then. It's astounding. It's like magic, their ascent to power. And the second card is the Sept de Mandala, the seven of mandalas. And that's the seven of coins in a Marseille Tarot deck, or it'd be the seven of pentacles in a Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And the last card for the three is the 10 de mandala, the 10 of mandalas. I'm getting a lot of mandalas whenever I do Middle Eastern countries because, well, they do have the money. So here we see the past being very magical, and we're going from a high arcana to a lower arcana, which is a descent. And then we're lifting up towards the future, but only a little bit. Now, the seven of mandalas, or the seven of coins, is a card that deals with economic expansionism, and it's new frontiers and horizons, new investments, new updates and upgrades, ways to enhance and expand one's economic profile. The 10 of mandalas, on the other hand, is vast wealth, intergenerational wealth, wealth that is too great to spend in one's lifetime, so they have to leave an estate for other people in the future. And of course, the magician represents sleight of hand, trickery, but also enormous magical skill and the ability to create something from nothing. And as I've said, that is exactly what the UAE is. It was nothing but just desert land. Then they found oil, and now it's one of the richest places on earth. And But right now they're going through some kind of expansionism. They have plenty of money. They'll never be a first world power like America, Russia, and China because they simply don't have the people. I mean, they could buy or acquire the same weapons as America or China or Russia, but not unlike Israel, there's a limits to growth. They don't have the 10 million man army of China, and they don't have the numbers, the sheer numbers of population we have in America or that exist in Russia to operate foreign bases and conduct multiple fronts of military warfare. So they are limited in what they can do, and they realize it. So they've got oil money and lots of it, and they have done mercenary work and are very profoundly astute at that. But that's not enough. They need to expand their horizons. You know, trade in art, trade in real estate, invest in stock markets, open up businesses, open up factories. You know, they need to have a use for their money. They can't just let it sit in a bank and rot. And the money that they have and the money that they will produce is wealth beyond compare. It is just unending wealth. It's enough money for 50 generations in the future. But let's look at this expansionism of the present, because that has a lot to do with what's going on in world affairs. And we have the Huit de Théière, which is the 8 of urns, and that is the 8 of cups in the Rider-Waite-Smith and Marseille system and Thoth system. So we have the 8 of cups below, which in the Marseille system is the card of involvement. In Rider-Waite-Smith, it's alienation. And we have the 4 de Scimitar, the 4 of scimitars, which is the 4 of swords, in the Marseille Tarot and in the Rider-Waite Tarot. Now, the 4 of swords is about a truce. It's about having an agreement and a truce and a contract and a treaty so that you're not currently fighting. You're resting, training, building up resources, but you're, not fighting currently. And the 8 of cups, as I said, is about involvement. So I think that this economic expansionism is about having political involvement and economic and social involvement in other countries. I mean, simply going into another country and building a parallel government and offending the nation state and having them shift allegiance to Qatar and Turkey instead of Saudi Arabia and UAE is not very successful. Supporting Haftar, who is basically a military butcher, he's got a horrible crime record in his military advances. He's currently under investigation for sending troops in to regions of Libya where they were holding people who were illegal immigrants and turning them into slaves for his military camps, and executing people there and wiping out entire cities and villages. So, the idea here is that for the UAE to support petty tyrants and turncoats, it's not going to get them very far. I mean, setting up a parallel government in Yemen, it may help American interests and Saudi interests, and they can get some Saudi money and American aid and some American military weapons out of it and some contracts for oil sales and some favoritism, but it doesn't really sail their boat. It doesn't really do enough to keep their economy going. And what I'm seeing here is that they would like to have involvement. They'd like to have a truce with many countries and set up international relations, contracts of trade. I think that what they'd like to do is to have client states in places like Sudan, where they can pump in the money, build the factories, have the Sudanese work in the factories, prop up the Sudanese government economy, but basically have their money grow and work for them. I mean, they have enough money to do this in 20 different countries around the world. They could go to Indonesia, which has a large Muslim population, the Sudan. They could go back to Somalia. And what they'd like to do is have ethical business practices that will be a good investment, a good long-term investment, where they can, just building a port in Somalia and then getting the centralized government at Mogadishu angry with you because you don't listen to them and build the port anyways after they've thrown you out of the country. It's not an economically enriching idea. And so what they really need to do is look at what the Chinese have done. They've built the same kind of ports. It's probably where they got the idea from originally. But then the ports became places of trade, and China makes money off that trade, and China converts the ports into military ports when the countries can't pay their bill on the loan to where they had the port built. So it involves a little bit more finesse and a little more sophistication than just sending in your military and trying to force a nation against its free will. And this is something the UAE needs to come to grips with. Now let's look at their wealth in the future and see what this is all about. And here we see the 4 of mandalas at the bottom. A lot of coin cards coming up because, that is what the UAE is about. It's about money. I mean, bottom line, it's oil dollars, oil rich, has lots of money, has rich cities, rich citizens. It wants to invest its money in foreign businesses, maybe in the art trade or in other international trades, so that it can, make more than bank interest and have further diversification than just involvement in the American stock market. So here is the card of economic security, and they have intergenerational wealth. I mean, they're just loaded. And here is the sept du cimetière, the 7 of scimitars, the 7 of swords. So as we're seeing here side by side, just so you know, there are 2 swords above as indicators of the middle and end card. And the sword cards are all about military. I mean, they're about information, knowledge, education, insight, but of the 4 suits, they are by far the most militant of the suits because they're swords. I mean, it's a weapon that even it goes beyond the idea of a wooden baton as a weapon. So in this instance, the 7 of swords, unlike the 4 of swords, which is truce, the 7 of swords is a little bit more, it's a little bit more aggressive militarily. In the Rider-Waite-Smith system, it is about espionage. And it's about stealing information and documents from other countries or other economic interests, corporate and national espionage. So that's a big thing, for them to get involved with. They have plenty of money and they've got mercenary work. Are they going to set up a Mossad-type espionage business? Is this what they have in mind to go the next step in militarism? Whatever happened to efficacy? Now, in the Marseille Tarot, the 7 of swords is a little bit different. It has to do with having the intelligence to come up with some kind of an idea, some kind of plan, a strategy. And it's about building strategies, okay? But whether you're building an actual secret service or you're built like Mossad, and they want to start an Arabic Mossad, or whether they want to actually build up a strategy for conquest and maybe national boundary expansionism into some of the desert wasteland, maybe even into Iraq. Maybe they want to take over Iraq. That would play in with the 7 of mandalas. You see, these 7s are about expansionism. The 6s show great prosperity. And when you have great prosperity, the next level up is 7, which is from 6 of prosperity to 7, which is about, investing or building a new infrastructure, putting in new technology, updating, upgrading in order to expand. And, I wouldn't be surprised the way these cards are reading if the UAE isn't eyeballing Iraq right now, which is highly politically unstable, and with an American green light and support from the American Green Zone. the UAE is a force to be reckoned with, and they could go in and play the strongman. Maybe they're tired of supporting petty dictators like in Somalia, in Libya, and elsewhere, and they would like to be the leader themselves and expand their geopolitical boundaries to include part or maybe all of Iraq, and then augment their coins' economic base with more coins, the oil fields of Iraq. You remember the ones that were lit on fire by shock and awe? And if we look at the 3 coins that are here, every time I get coins with Middle Eastern countries, ever since a previous reading I had done that's published on YouTube, the black just really strikes me as oil. And the white can be the legal limitations, the OPEC restrictions, the sanctions, the British Petroleum and Exxon hold on the oil because they're the ones who drill and slant drill. But there's definitely oil trade going on here. And the one thing about the UAE, they'll use the petrodollars. There's a real crisis right now with petrodollars because Russia's rising. And the reason why Iraq and Libya were bombed and why Iran might get attacked is because they stopped using the petrodollar, which is using American currency to trade petroleum. It was agreed upon that America would print money specifically for the oil trade. And if that were ever stopped by any major oil producer like Venezuela or Iran, then the American dollar would just plummet and become worthless. And so to prevent that from happening, America tends to go in and annihilate countries that decide to trade in other currencies than the American dollar, which is the petrodollar. And so one thing about the UAE, they will trade in the petrodollar, and America may see them as a safe bet. And Iraq is a war zone. It's like Libya. It was bombed to the Stone Age, and now they're just our warlords and Islamicist factions and just marauders with guns, and it's worse than the Wild West ever was in America. Anything goes. Roadside bombs, people going down the street with a donkey that pull out of the side saddle of the donkey, SAM missile launchers. It's just an astounding place of increasing violence and instability. And one thing the oil companies want is some kind of economic stability so they can pull out their oil. I mean, they'll pay a little more because if they don't pay more for economic stability, they end up paying 5 times as much for insurance to get that oil to the market. And the insurance on oil is astoundingly high in places like Libya and Iraq where there's so much uncertainty. And with Iran threatening the Strait of Hormuz, I'll bet you anything that this magic card and these ascent cards of wealth really speak of some kind of a military front that is not actionable now because of the 4 of Swords, but they may be prepping for it. And there may be a military expansionism, not just into the spycraft, but into the actual conquering of Iraq, maybe Libya, maybe Syria, where there's a lot of problems right now. Now, the UAE can't take on the Russian forces of Syria, but combined with Israel, Saudi Arabia, America, I'm sure a coalition force can be made. And, we are dealing with the 8 of Urns here, which, as I said, is involvement. And so I think that it's just the beginning of the UAE's involvement in the international scene, in the international geopolitical arena of conquest, imperialism, client states, domination, oil exploitation, and casualties.